15 years. That's the entire lifespan of the Qin Dynasty as a unified imperial state. A political system that unified a fragmented continent-sized territory, standardized its writing system, its weights, its roads, even the axle width of carts, and then disappeared so fast that later historians sometimes treat it like a violent administrative experiment rather than a dynasty. But here's the strange part. The China that exists today, not culturally but structurally, still carries fingerprints of that brief period more than 2,000 years ago. And that raises an uncomfortable question we'll keep circling back to. How does something so short-lived become so foundational? Because the obvious interpretation is collapse. The Qin unified China in 221 BCE under Qin Shi Huang, pushed through extreme centralization, and by 206 BCE, the system had fractured under rebellion and internal strain. Case closed, in theory. Except history doesn't really close cases that neatly. What actually breaks here is not just a dynasty, but a design philosophy of governance that would outlive it. The stakes are easier to miss if you look at it like a traditional rise and fall story. But zoom out slightly and the implications shift. The Qin state was the first large-scale attempt in East Asia to replace feudal fragmentation with direct bureaucratic control. Officials appointed from the center, law standardized across regions, authority no longer distributed through hereditary local elites. That structure is efficient, almost brutally so. We know from the Shiji records attributed to Sima Qian that the Qin legal code was deliberately strict, designed to eliminate ambiguity in enforcement. Collective responsibility systems meant entire households could be punished for individual crimes. This wasn't chaos, it was coherence pushed to its limit, and that's where the tension begins. Because a system optimized for control tends to accumulate resistance in places it doesn't immediately see. Not in armies first, but in labor quotas, taxation pressure, infrastructure demands. The kind of friction that doesn't look political until it suddenly is. There's a detail often missed. Massive infrastructure projects, like the early Great Wall expansions and road networks, were not symbolic. They were logistical arteries for a state trying to maintain administrative reach over newly unified territories that had never been governed as one unit before. And then it collapsed. Not slowly in the way empires usually fade, but in a chain reaction that followed the death of Qin Shi Huang in 210 BCE, accelerating into open rebellion by 209 BCE. The human anchor matters here. In the northeastern commanderies, local officials weren't just losing authority, they were receiving contradictory orders from a central court that was already fragmenting politically. One messenger arrival delayed by weeks could flip an entire region from compliance to revolt. That's how fragile hyper-centralized systems become when information velocity doesn't match territorial scale. My read is simple but not comfortable. Qin didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was too tightly engineered for a world that still relied on human delay, corruption, and distance. The question I keep coming back to is whether the system was ever meant to survive its own success. Prediction. The Qin model doesn't vanish after 206 BCE. It gets inherited, softened, and reassembled by later dynasties who quietly accept its core idea, that China works best when held together by a single, standardized administrative spine. And that's where the story really starts, not ends. The standard story after the Qin collapse is simple. Harsh laws, forced labor, rebellion, end of experiment. Then the Han Dynasty arrives and fixes it. But if you actually track the administrative machinery that survived 206 BCE, that explanation starts to feel too clean. Because the Han didn't replace the Qin system. They selectively deleted parts of it. The backbone stayed. And that backbone was bureaucratic centralization anchored in written law. standardized administration, and direct state control over territory. Not through local hereditary lords, but through appointed officials who rotated between regions. That idea doesn't die with Qin Shi Huang. It survives because the scale problem doesn't go away when the dynasty changes. The Han founder Liu Bang, later Emperor Gaozu, is often framed as the anti-Qin figure. A commoner turned emperor, supposedly rejecting Qin rigidity. But in practice, his early court quickly ran into a structural problem. Once you control a unified territory of that size, decentralization stops being ideology and becomes administrative failure. So the Han compromises. They reintroduce limited feudal enfeoffment, giving territory to relatives and allies, but they keep Qin-style commanderies under direct imperial administration. Two systems running in parallel, one politically stabilizing, one structurally efficient, and over time, the efficient one wins. A useful detail here is the civil service examination system that begins to mature later in the Han period. It doesn't appear fully formed, but the logic is already present. Merit-based selection tied to state ideology and textual knowledge. That is pure Qin inheritance, softened through Confucian language. Now the contradiction becomes clearer. The Qin dynasty is remembered as a failure because it collapsed quickly. But the system it built was not discarded. It was domesticated. There's a tension here that most summaries miss. Feudal systems distribute power. Bureaucratic systems concentrate it. Qin chose concentration without insulation, meaning pressure built up with no release mechanism. Han keeps the concentration but adds political buffers, ideology, moral governance rhetoric, and controlled decentralization. One way to think about it, Qin built a high-pressure engine with no cooling system. Han rebuilt the same engine but added vents. And yet the original architecture remains visible in the physical geography of governance. Commanderies, standardized legal codes, tax collection systems, all trace back to Qin reforms implemented in less than 2 decades under Li Si's administrative direction. There's a quiet irony here. Li Si, the architect of unification policies like script standardization and legal uniformity, is often remembered as an enforcer of harshness. But from a systems perspective, his real contribution was interoperability. Once regions can communicate through the same script and be governed under the same legal categories, fragmentation becomes harder to sustain. That's the part that outlives him. Open loop from part 1. The question of information velocity becomes more visible here. The Han improves communication infrastructure incrementally, courier systems, relay stations, administrative reporting hierarchies. Because without faster information flow, centralized governance always risks operating on outdated reality. There's a case recorded during early Han consolidation efforts where a regional administrator delayed reporting unrest because formal channels required multiple verification layers. By the time the message reached the capital, the revolt had already expanded beyond containment. It's a small incident, but structurally important. Bureaucracy doesn't just enforce order, it can also delay reaction to disorder. And this is where the Qin legacy becomes almost invisible, which is why it's rarely discussed directly. It doesn't persist as a dynasty. It persists as assumptions about how large-scale governance must function. Opinion line: the Qin system didn't fail because it was irrational. It failed because it assumed control could scale faster than human error. Doubt/question. But the harder question is whether any continental-sized state can avoid that assumption once it chooses uniformity over fragmentation. Prediction: by the time we reach later imperial China, especially Tang and Ming systems, the Qin blueprint will be so embedded that even its critics are unknowingly building on its foundations rather than escaping them. And that leads into something more uncomfortable in the next section: how stability itself became dependent on the very mechanisms that originally caused collapse. There's a moment in Chinese administrative history where the question stops being, why did Qin collapse? and quietly becomes, why did anything else work at all? Because once the Han stabilizes the framework, what follows isn't a rejection of Qin logic, it's refinement under constraint, and the constraint is scale. By the Western Han period, the empire stretches across a territory that includes the North China Plain, the Wei River Valley, parts of modern Sichuan, and frontier commanderies pushing into what is now Gansu. Even at conservative estimates, we're talking about governance over tens of millions of people without anything resembling modern communications. In that environment, the Qin idea of uniform administrative law stops being ideological. It becomes operational necessity. But here's where the structure gets interesting. The system begins to accumulate contradictions it cannot fully resolve. Take taxation. Han fiscal policy depends on land tax measured in grain output. That requires local reporting accuracy, which depends on local officials, who are themselves evaluated by the same central authority they might misreport to. It's a loop, a self-referential system where information is both the input and the output. And when systems become self-referential like that, small distortions compound. A recorded issue during the reign of Emperor Wu of Han shows this clearly. Military expansion into the south and west dramatically increased logistical strain. Grain shipments from the Central Plains had to be redirected over long distances, often with significant loss due to spoilage and theft. Official reports still showed acceptable yields, because lower-level administrators had incentives to preserve their records rather than accuracy. So the center sees stability, the periphery experiences strain. Both are technically true. That duality is important, because it shows that the system isn't simply failing, it is producing multiple versions of reality depending on administrative position. Now step back from the data and look at the structure. Qin built the skeleton, standardized law, centralized authority, commandery administration. Han adds muscle, ideology, Confucian moral framing, flexible political distribution. But the nervous system, the information network, remains fundamentally slow and hierarchical, which creates a persistent lag between reality and response. Here's the reversal that usually gets missed in simplified histories. The Qin collapse was not a rejection of centralization. It was a warning about latency. And later dynasties didn't solve that problem. They managed it. By the Tang Dynasty, postal relay systems are more sophisticated. By the Song, documentation and fiscal tracking become more detailed. By the Ming, surveillance and reporting expand further. Each iteration increases resolution, but never fully eliminates delay. There's a reason for that. Physics, not politics. Human movement speed. Horse relay speed. River transport constraints. Even with improvements, information in imperial China still travels in days or weeks, not seconds. So the system adapts by building redundancy rather than speed. More officials, more layers, more verification steps. But redundancy creates friction, and friction creates distortion. Human anchor here. In frontier garrisons during the Han expansion into the He corridor, small military units often operated on delayed instructions from Chang'an. Decisions were made locally because waiting for confirmation would mean losing tactical opportunities. Over time, this trained a culture of semi-autonomous execution inside a nominally centralized system. It is centralization that behaves locally when necessary, then reports upward afterward. That flexibility is why the system survives. But it is also why it never becomes fully stable in the way modern states imagine stability. Opinion line. The Qin dynasty is often treated as an overreach, but in structural terms, it was an early attempt to compress governance time, to make decision cycles match territorial size. It failed, but the problem it identified never went away. Doubt/question. What if every large empire since then has been operating under the same delay problem, just with better paperwork instead of better solutions. Prediction. As we move into modern digital states, the real discontinuity won't be ideology. It will be whether information latency finally stops being the hidden constraint that shapes political power. And in the final section, it becomes hard to avoid the uncomfortable conclusion. Maybe the Qin didn't vanish at all. Maybe it just stopped looking like a dynasty. At some point, the Qin dynasty disappeared narrative stops being useful. Because what actually vanishes in 206 BCE is not a system of governance, but a specific implementation of it, one that tried to enforce uniformity without buffering its own intensity. Everything after that is adjustment. Even the word dynasty becomes slightly misleading here. It suggests replacement. What you really see is iterative engineering under different ruling houses. By the time you reach the Sui and Tang, the administrative spine is unmistakable. Centralized appointment of officials, standardized law codes, and a capital-centered decision structure. The Sui reunification in 581 CE, in particular, looks less like a fresh start and more like a reassembly of long-standing components that had already been stress-tested centuries earlier. And that brings us back to the open loop from the beginning, why something so short-lived becomes so foundational. The answer isn't cultural memory or historical admiration. It's structural lock-in. Once a large territory has been unified under a standardized administrative system, fragmentation becomes expensive. Not just politically, but economically and logistically. Roads, tax systems, grain transport networks, written language, all of it starts to assume continuity. Reversing that would require dismantling infrastructure that future governance depends on. There's a subtle but important point here. The Qin didn't just unify China politically, it unified the cost of governance. And that cost structure never resets. So when later dynasties reject Qin harshness, what they're actually doing is redistributing pressure, not removing it. Confucian ideology softens legitimacy. Bureaucratic expansion spreads workload. Local autonomy absorbs shocks. But the center remains the coordinating logic. Even in moments of fragmentation, like the Three Kingdoms period or the late Tang breakdown, the idea of reunification never disappears. It keeps returning because the underlying system design makes reunification the path of least resistance once conditions allow it. Now zoom out. Across 2 millennia, what you're really watching is a slow convergence toward a governance model that prioritizes coherence over plurality. Not because it is morally preferred, but because it is structurally cheaper at scale. And this is where the modern reflection becomes unavoidable. The People's Republic of China today operates with a level of centralized coordination that, in some ways, rhymes with Qin logic. Standardized policy direction, strong center-periphery hierarchy, and rapid implementation capacity across vast territory. The tools are different, the speed is different, but the underlying question of scale versus control remains unchanged. Of course, the counter-argument matters. A centralized system can misread local conditions, suppress feedback, and accumulate blind spots. That criticism is historically consistent from Qin onward, and it is not wrong. But it is also incomplete because decentralized fragmentation carries its own costs: slower coordination, uneven development, and difficulty responding to continental-scale challenges. Both models fail under different conditions, which brings us to the more uncomfortable takeaway. The Qin problem was never solved, only managed under different technological constraints. Opinion line. Qin Shi Huang is often portrayed as a ruler obsessed with permanence. But what he actually built was a system obsessed with coordination speed, one that outpaced its own political tolerance, doubt/question. And if modern communication networks reduce the latency problem that haunted ancient empires, does that finally change the balance between centralization and fragmentation? Or does it just shift where the pressure builds? Prediction. The next major evolution of state power won't come from ideology or borders, but from who controls real-time coordination across systems too large for any single human hierarchy to fully understand. And maybe that's the quiet legacy of a dynasty that lasted less than 2 decades. It didn't disappear. It set the default settings for how large systems try to hold themselves together. And we're still living inside the consequences of that design choice. If you want to support more deep dives like this, subscribe. But more importantly, watch how often modern new systems are just old constraints wearing better technology.